Hello again, this is Professor Robert Linz at University of Colorado Boulder. In this video, we'll be looking at how to conduct federal regulatory research. This is really just a high-level overview of the publications and some of the methods that you'll need in order to find regulations. So what is it that you need to know? What is it that we're going to cover in this brief video? First of all, we'll look at the regulatory publications that publish the regulations, and we'll look at their relationship to each other. Second of all, we'll look at the purpose and importance of enabling acts and how agencies need to have these enabling acts to create the regulations. Thirdly, we'll look at the relationship between legislation and regulation. Fourthly, we'll look at sources for the Code of Federal Regulations as well as the Federal Register. Fifthly, we'll look at source methods to find regulations. And lastly, we'll look at how to research regulations, which includes how to read a regulation and how to update a regulation. So first of all, what are the regulatory publications and what is the relationship to each other? This is really defined by the Administrative Procedures Act. If you're reading along, if you look at the Sloan book on page 236, she goes through the Administrative Procedures Act. The reason why the publications are tied to the APA is that the APA specifies that agencies have to meet three requirements before they can promulgate or issue a regulation. First of all, they have to notify the public when an agency plans to promulgate new regulations or change existing ones. Secondly, they need to publish proposed regulations and solicit public comment. And finally, they have to publish the final regulations before they go into effect. And all of these steps make sense in order to not only inform the public what the regulations are, but give the public, individuals, businesses, etc., time to change their procedures and prepare to comply with the new regulation. So the first of these publications is the Federal Register, and this is the daily, as to say, the business daily newspaper for federal government agencies. What you will find in the Federal Register are the proposed regulations, meeting notices for when those regulations will be discussed. You will also find the final regulations, as well as presidential signing statements and some information on how to update regulations. So the Federal Register is the one source you look at for newly promulgated regulations, as well as you can do historical research into it. The other publication that agencies use to inform the public about regulations is the Code of Federal Regulations. Like all codes, the CFR is a subject organization or regulations currently in effect at the time the code is compiled. After regulation is finalized and published in the Federal Register, it is then also placed in the CFR. However, the CFR is not published daily, as is the Federal Register, but published each quarter. And this is a little confusing, as about 1/4 of the titles are updated annually, with the complete set updated over the course of the year. So the first 15 or so titles are updated each January 1st, while the next 15 or so titles are updated on April 1st, and the third quarter updated on July 1st, and the final set updated and of course published on October 1st. It's a little confusing. The key is to check the date in which the regulation that you're researching was last updated, and then use one of the updating tools we'll mention at the end of the lecture for any more current changes to the regulation. There are about 50 titles in the CFR, roughly corresponding to the 54 titles of the United States Code, but here the hierarchy follows agency as well as subject matter. In addition to final regulations, you'll also find under Title III, presidential proclamations and executive orders. There's an interesting publication history for both the Federal Register and really the Code of Federal Regulations. The early history is that prior to 1863, there were no executive agencies. The first one was developed in 1863 as a comptroller of the currency. By 1934, as more agencies were created and more regulations were promulgated, essentially the agencies were losing track of what regulations had been promulgated. There's somewhat of a famous case where the Department of Justice was arguing a case before the U.S. Supreme Court based on a regulation which actually had been repealed. Not good. In the 1930s and 1936, Congress enacted the Federal Register Act to solve this problem, and it empowered the U.S. archivist to publish a single daily newspaper for all agencies. That newspaper is the Federal Register. And then in 1946, the Congress passed the Administrative Procedures Act, which we just talked about, which allows the public to be informed of and participate in the rulemaking process. So this brings me to a question for you all, a comparison, and that's this, that the statutes at large are to the U.S. Code as the Federal Register is to the Code of Federal Regulations, right? Just as we covered it before. Whereas just as the statutes at large for statutory law are those statutes enacted by Congress, and then they are put into a subject code so that it's easier for researchers to use. The Federal Register essentially is the same thing, right? It's the final regulations put into a chronological publication, and then those final regulations put into a code, which makes it easier for us as researchers to find all the regulations currently impacting our research problem. So what else do we need to know? The purpose and importance of enabling acts. So before a agency can even issue a regulation, they have to receive authority from Congress. They need to have statutory authority. So typically what happens is the Congress will create an act and they will empower an agency to produce regulations. And in fact, the act itself may create the agency, and it may give them a general grant of authority to create all regulations necessary to implement this legislation, or specific grants of authority for particular parts of the legislation that the agency can issue regulations to do that. So that brings us to this idea of what's the relationship between legislation and regulation. Well, essentially, the legislative body is the policymaker, and the executive branch implements the procedures or issues the procedures to implement the policy. So between the two branches of government, in a sense, the legislative branch is superior to the executive branch because the executive branch is dependent upon legislative policy before they can issue regulations. And this is an important part of the research step, that when an agency issues a regulation, one of the things a researcher should check is to make sure that they acted under a grant of authority from the legislature. And this can sometimes be a point of contention when an agency begins to issue regulations that may be a little bit outside of what maybe was intended by Congress in any piece of legislation. So where do we find the CFR and the FR? Well, as you might expect, all the online sources are going to have it: Lexis, Westlaw, Bloomberg. You can also find both the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations on Hein Online. Here it is actually in PDF format. They have the full run of both publications back to their date of inception in the 1930s and 1940s. And again, as I say, it's in PDF, so you're looking at it as if you were looking at it in print. This is very nice. You can also find it on the government sites, FDsys and GovInfo, and you can find an ECFR, although the ECFR version of it is unofficial, though we use ECFR to update our regulations. One of the things we might ask ourselves as we do our research is how do these sources compare in terms of cost, coverage, currency, and usability? You'll find as you do research that which of these resources you go to will depend a little bit on those four factors. The ones from the government are free, but they may lack some of the bells and whistles, some of the annotations and editorial enhancements that you will get if you used the regulatory publications on Lexis or Westlaw. Hein Online is a subscription service. We provide it free because the library pays for it. But if you go into practice, you need to have your own subscription, and it can be expensive. All right, how do we find regulations? Well, it's a little bit like finding statutes. You can, of course, can have a regulatory citation, right? You have a citation to the CFR or the FR. You might have a statutory citation in which you then can use to find regulations that implement that statute. Of course, you can go to one of the online resources and type in keywords into the search engine, or if you're using it in print, and both these publications are still available in print, although perhaps not for much longer, you can use the keywords in the index. And of course, the other approach is to take that contextual topical approach and look in the table of contents. This is not quite as crazy as it sounds. If you want to find the regulations issued by a particular agency, you could look for the agency's regulations in the CFR and see what's available, kind of poke through it that way. Once you find the regulation, you'll need to be able to read the regulation and then conduct further research. So again, this is a little bit like looking at a statute. Here is a page taken from Lexis Advance for 9 CFR 1124. And as you read through the regulation, you're reading it for context. You're reading it for a sense for where this regulation exists within the overall regulatory scheme. You'll see that in the first red arrow is that we're in Title IX. This deals with Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, Department of Agriculture. So this is the department that issued it. And it's Subchapter A, Animal Welfare, and Part 11, Horse Protection Regulations. And here's the text of the regulation itself at the third arrow, and the title is Reporting by Management. So you'd read this like you read a statute. Importantly, as I mentioned earlier, statutory authority is necessary for the agency to issue the regulation, and here it's listed. They cite to 15 U.S.C. 1823, etc. as their statutory authority to issue this regulation. And then if you wanted to look at the historical development of this regulation, like the source notes that we looked at for statutes, here is the history of this regulation. It was first published at volume 44 of the Federal Register at page 25,179. As I mentioned, the Federal Register is a daily publication. It ranges in pages from day one on January 2nd through the end of the year, tens of thousands of pages. So it was initially issued in 1979, and then you see it was amended again at volume 48 of the Federal Register in 1983, and again in 1990, and right on through, finally to 1998. So that is the regulatory history. You could look at any of those prior issues of the Federal Register to see what the regulation looked like at the time it was issued. Okay, what about updating regulations? There are a few different methods in which to update a regulation. As you will discover if you do regulatory research in print or the analog that's made available through the government websites, you would use two tools. One of these is the LSA, which is the list of sections affected. And you would find that both in the CFR that you're doing research in, as well as in the Federal Register. And it's a little wonky to explain it in print. The bottom line is that both those publications will inform you if your regulation, the section that you're looking at, has been updated by giving you a table of those regulations impacted for that particular publication of the CFR, or that particular publication of the Federal Register. In practice, what you're going to really want to use is this website, eCFR, which is a publication of the federal government. It's the electronic code of federal regulations. So this is quite nice. What you'd end up doing is you'll use the navigation menu provided on their website and to type in to get to the code, the regulation section that you're looking for, and voila, it'll give you the latest statement of what that regulation is. Having said that, you can see that gigantic user notice in the middle of that screenshot. The ECFR is not the official version of the CFR. Practically, that may not make much of difference, but you ought to know that that is a disclaimer that is issued by the government itself. Okay, so what else is there for administrative research? Regulations are just one kind of law produced by administrative agencies, but the administrative or the executive branch administrative agencies produce other kinds of law. There are agency decisions, there are guidance documents, reports, there are attorney general opinions, and a range of presidential documents, including signing statements, executive orders, and proclamations. All of these sorts of law, we'd also want to go and research given the particular research problem that we have, but they're beyond the scope of this Foundations course. If you sign up for an advanced legal research course, you'll be introduced to what these are and where to find them. So if you have any questions, please let me know. In the meantime, I'll see you later. Thank you. Okay, so at this point, let's use Westlaw, Lexis Advance, and a few of the free resources to locate the applicable regulation that allows us to find a permit for dredging and filling this kind of property. Let's also assume for starting the research that we've been led to a particular section of the United States Code that's applicable to our problem, and that section is 33 United States Code, section 1344. And let's make that our starting point. So we can simply search in the search bar 33 USC 1344, and Westlaw will pull that up. And here it is. This is permits for dredged or filled material. And we find that it's within Title 33 on navigation, navigable waters, which is what we would expect after having done some research now in the statutes and with the Clean Water Act. Chapter 26 deals with water pollution prevention and control. Subchapter 4, permits and licenses. And here is the text of the statute itself. And indeed, we do find that this does apply to our problem. We're particularly interested in Section E here on general permits on state, regional, nationwide basis. Probably F2 on non-prohibited discharge of dredged or filled material. Perhaps we don't need a permit for what we're doing. The rest of the code section goes into other details. The one thing we'll want to pull out, though, from reading it is what agency is responsible for issuing the regulation. And it says in this first paragraph, the Secretary may issue permits after notice and opportunity for public hearings for the discharge of dredged or filled material into the navigable waters. So who's the Secretary? We read a little further down into the code section, and the Secretary is defined. It tells us the Secretary means the Secretary of the Army acting through the Chief of Engineers. In other words, we're looking for the Army Corps of Engineers. So that's the agency we want to find. So we want to go from the statutes to the regulations, connectivity. The way we can do that is we would go to the citing references, and we see that there are, in fact, 287 regulations related to this particular code section. So let's open that up and see if we can find a regulation issued by the Department of Army, the Army Corps of Engineers, in order to do permits for filling. Well, there are 287. That's a lot of regulations. We see a long list here, starting in Title 7 of the CFR. We're also going to note that there are both state and federal regulations. Let's go ahead and do a narrowing just by eliminating state regulations. Clearly, we're not looking for any state regulations from the Army Corps of Engineers. And that brings us to 180, which is a bit of an improvement. I suspect if we start looking through these top results, we'll find it. We can, though, even do a little bit better and search within our results and look for something like discharge within the same sentence as permit. And so here we want to use our Boolean operator terms and connector search, and that we've learned how to do, and we click on continue and then apply the filters, and that long list now becomes a somewhat more manageable list of 40 results. And now we can start eyeing through and realize these are all, almost all of these are now in Title 33, which is about navigable water. So we're in the right zone. And skimming the results, we see 323.1 is general, but here this is something 323.3 discharges requiring permits, discharges not requiring permits. So we have a context issue. Is this the right code section? We see something in 33 CFR 325 duration and permits. We'll make a guess about this, and what we'll do is, instead of jumping right into this code section, we're going to go to the first one. If you see, these are in series, point 1, point 2, point 3. So this is a collection of code sections, and this is actually the leading one in terms of the references and annotations. So let's start there and find out what this is all about if we're in the right section of the code. And slowly Westlaw churns, and it gives us back a result. Well, sort of. Here we are. Permits for discharge of dredged or fill material in the waters of the United States. Army Corps of Engineers. I think this probably does it. It cites statutory authority for the regulations, 33 U.S.C. 1344. That's great. That's where we was our departing point. It even gives us a currency that this section is current through this date and this issue of the Federal Register. Let's look at the next code section. Now remember, it was generally, I think. Let's go ahead and look at that. General, and it tells us what this is all about. This regulation prescribes those special policies, practices, and procedures will follow the Corps of Engineers in connection with the review of applications for permits to authorize the discharge of dredged fill material in waters of the United States. Okay, I think this is probably it. At least we're in the general section. We're still not to the exact regulation we need. Let's go, and we could arrow key through, right? Go to the next section using these arrow keys. We could also look at a table of contents, though. It brings us out and sees the few sections involved. Let's go to discharges requiring permits, and it jumps us to that section now, 323.3. It gives us some information about what's required and what is not required. And then we can go to the next section, 323.4. Let's check that, because this discharge is not requiring permits. So as lawyers, we would research, look at the particular language applied to our section, but we found where we are in the code. So we took the approach of starting the statute and going to the regulation that was linked to the statute. Let's go to Lexis Advanced and take a different approach, a more topical approach. Let's look at the structure of the CFR itself and see if we can find it that way, using the knowledge that we know we're going to be in Title 33, and we know we're looking for the Army Corps of Engineers. So here we would want to go to Administrative Codes and Regulations. Of course, we could certainly type up here Code of Federal Regulations, but just so you see where it's situated, we can go to Administrative Codes and Regulations in Lexis Advance. We can approach it this way, or we can approach it this way in Federal. Let's go ahead and look at it through the Federal approach. And now here is the CFR. You can look at the information bubble again to check currency and coverage. But we can start in the Code of Federal Regulations, and it brings us to this title listing of the CFR. And we could scroll through the title listing, and because we're now educated about where it is in the USC, we also can make a guess where it is in the USC, the CFR, and it would be under Title 33, Navigation, Navigable Waters. Why don't we scroll down? Here's the Department of the Army, Army Corps of Engineers. We look at that next. But there are a lot of parts and subparts. Now, we know the answer, right? We know we need to be in 323. This is here, permits for discharges of dredged or fill material. If you didn't know that, one way you could expedite your research through all of these table of contents is to go back up to the search bar and search within a table of contents. Now I'm going to make life easier on me, and I'm going to click on this little magnifying glass. And what this does is it limits my search just to Title 33 of the code. You see it up here, narrow by Title 33, Navigation, Navigable Waters. Then I'm going to look under Table of Contents, and now we want discharge, and same sentence is permit, right? We can use the same terms and connectors between Lexis and Westlaw. And what do we get? Click on the search button, and we come back with two results. Part 323.3, discharge requiring permits. Point 4, not requiring permits. These are the same sections we saw in Westlaw. And it worked, right? We filtered through that long list to bring us to the exact results. It pulls us into 323. We see the overall scheme here in the code, and then we can open up to any of these code sections, which we can do, and here it is. And we already know the language itself, right? Same statutory authority, a regulatory history where it derived in the Federal Register, and then it has annotations, which is a nice version of the Lexis CFR to applicable cases. So that's two different approaches for searching for regulation from the statute or from the table of contents in the CFR. Let's look at two of the free resources that are available. One is the eCFR. Now again, this is not the official version of the CFR provided by the federal government, but it's one that's fairly easy to use. So our approach we just used was to browse. Let's assume we needed to go and I wanted to find the regulations by the Army Corps of Engineers, and by title we can do that. It gives us this list of titles, and here's Title 33, Navigation and Navigable Waters. We click on Go, and it provides us this table structure, and we're going back to where we were in Lexis Advanced. We also have various search options. We can do a simple search, and we can do Boolean and proximity searches. And in this case, we know the code section we want, 33 CFR 323.3. Let's assume you knew that going into using this tool. Here is a way in which you can do a search. You can enter the title number, you can search for text here, and then you have various fields you can use, including the part, a subpart, a section number, section heading. What about just free text searching? And can we do terms and connector searching in this database? We see we have Boolean and we have proximity. Those would be worth looking at, but when we come to a new database like this, what we want to do is look for any sort of guidance that it may provide, any sort of online help. We look at search tips, and that's encouraging. So what does this say to us? Hey, listen, there are two ways to use the eCFR, the browse feature and then these various search features. And it tells us what the proximity search does and the Boolean search does, a little bit like our terms and connector searching. And then it provides us with some examples, opportunities for wildcards. So now we become better searchers for looking at this online help. We could go back to these search options and run a search for that code section. There are a few other interesting things provided about the eCFR. You can actually download the regulations. There's this very useful, though, parallel table of authorities and rules for the CFR and the U.S. Code. This is something you should take a look at, because it provides you with what regulations have been implemented by what statutory authority. So it's a little bit awkward in this view, but you see 1 USC 112 generates CFR 1 CFR Part 2, essentially 22 CFR Part 181, etc. So this is a more direct way to tie statutory authority to regulations. One more resource to look at, then we'll be done. This is the Code of Federal Regulations provided by GovInfo, and this would be the official version of it. You can find out information about the publication schedule of the CFR and other information, and then you can browse editions of the CFR. You see the most recent one is 2017, but they have them going back back to 1996. So we could pull up our section again in Title 33, and by drilling down, finding it, Title 33, it's a bit of a navigation. There's the Army Corps of Engineers, and here is 323, I'm sorry, that's what we're looking for, 323. And again, you'll see it, and you can get access to it as a PDF or an XML. If we open it up as a PDF, this is the equivalent of looking at the CFR in print. It is the print page. It's an authenticated copy of the CFR, so we can be assured that is exactly what the law was published as. Okay, so that's all I have to say about researching regulations. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.